My guess is that as we gather this day and hear this gospel proclamation, most of us listen to this text and probably would not chalk it up in 10 of our favorite Bible passages. My guess is it wouldn't find its way into the top 20 or the top 100. And yet, here is this text for us to think about, to wrestle with, to try to gain some sense of understanding about what Jesus was talking about and how it might apply to us today. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have been reading lately about an evangelical pastor named Rob Bell. Rob Bell wrote a book called Love Wins. And he goes on, and the subtitle to it is Heaven, Hell, and the Fate of Every Person Who Ever Lived. Quite a title, I think, for someone to pursue. Now, Rob Bell has created quite an uproar, particularly in evangelical circles, as that is his background. Because all of a sudden, this evangelical pastor is putting forward the notion that maybe, just maybe, God has created all people and loves all people. And perhaps this loving and creative God wouldn't condemn the people whom God has created to an eternal hell based on a pretty short span of time that we call life. Now, there is fury among some people to take away this understanding of hell. Whereas as I sit with many of my colleagues and friends and look at this, they simply smile and say, well, many mainline pastors and people, parishioners in the pews, have been thinking about this and talking about this for a long, long time. What's the big deal now? The big deal is that it is someone speaking from a tradition that has held very closely to this sense of heaven and hell, of good and bad, of right and wrong. Now, it hadn't hit home for me, at least not at a significant level, until this past week at about 11:30 at night, as Bill and I and Torin were sitting with some friends of Bill's and now mine in East Tennessee. And as we were sitting there in East Tennessee, having a beer at 11:30 at night, one of the women said, I've been reading a book, and I have some questions. And I thought, what book is this? And she said, have you read Love Wins by Rob Bell? And I thought, oh no. Here we go. But she was sincerely wrestling with what this meant, coming out of a very evangelical tradition. She believes in the goodness of humanity. She believes in God's love and care for all of humanity. And she believes in a Jesus who is a teacher, a redeemer, a helper, and someone who draws us into God's eternal love and light. And I said, beyond that, what's your problem? Or your struggle with this? And she said, well, there are people who do bad things. And I want to know that they get punished. I've been sitting with that, wondering, what is it about us? And it's not just this young woman in East Tennessee, but about each of us that wants to see justice meted out in some fashion. We want to know that we are right in comparison to someone else. And it happens on both sides of the political aisle. It happens in different religious sects or denominations. It happens simply when we sit down at the same coffee table with friends. We want to know that we're right. And maybe they're not quite as right as we are. And unfortunately, one of the places where it plays out most is in the context of churches. That even when we gather together as a community, we like to know that maybe we're just a little bit better than than so-and-so. Because we work a little bit harder, or we serve on another committee, or we sing in the choir. Or perhaps that there is something that we know about someone else where they're just a little bit too snooty sometimes. Or have you heard that they go out and they like to party a little bit more? We could go back to the pietistic history in many of our churches where people were constantly talking about who was dancing or playing cards, where who was going over to that place on the corner and taking a little snip now and then. It's not so far removed from who we are. But what today become those places of struggle, of contention in our church?